Welcome. Elliot and I just had the pleasure of interviewing Peter Panagore, who we interviewed for our first short film here on the channel. It was a real treat to just have him on and get to ask him all sorts of questions and unpack a bit about his experience living with a near-death experience. He actually got to share his second near-death experience with us. And we're excited to be interviewing more guests. And it was a real treat to have Peter on as our first guest on the podcast. And we hope that you enjoy it. Peter, welcome to the podcast. You are our first official guest on our podcast here on the channel. For everyone watching, we just want to let you know that my brother and I and John, our cameraman and editor, filmed Peter for our first short film documentary piece on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't watched that yet, feel free to go to our video section on the channel and give it a watch. And so what that means is, since we dedicated that short film piece to Peter's a little bit before his near-death experience, and then his ice climbing and his freezing to death and his near-death experience, today is going to be more of a casual conversation where my brother and I get to pick Peter's brain and ask him lots of questions about his life in general. And so, Peter, just to start, something that I'm always fascinated with people that have had a near-death experience is I'm always interested in how people integrate their experience into their everyday lives. I've heard and read a lot of people that say it can take months and years to fully integrate or even understand what happened to them. So maybe you can start there, where you're coming down the mountain, and you shared a little bit of this in our film, but in the weeks and months following, what was your experience like?
Difficult, dark, lonesome, isolated, confused, and alien. And it took me at least 20 years to integrate. And I did all of the integration, most of it, on my own, because there was no one to turn to back in 1981. And so when I first came back to my body after I died, I was on the mountainside, and I had been in a state of wholeness and wellness and no suffering. And it wasn't as if suffering had been set aside. It's as if it never existed for me. And all that existed for me was wellness and wholeness. When I first entered my body, all there was suffering. Suffering was the overlay of everything. And it was deep and thick and dark and difficult and dense and overbearing. And I was in this state of confusion and lostness. But as my brain came back up to functioning, I recognized my body and my character, my personality, my old identity. But I was entirely different. And from that moment forward, until today, and I'm sure tomorrow, I have been living in an alternate reality from where I had been living the day before. And so my integration process first began with survival. So the first thing I had to try to do was to keep this body alive. And that involved getting off the ice climb and into the tent, where we could treat ourselves for hypothermia, which we did. And maybe you guys recall I had a background in first aid and wilderness first aid because I was on the ski patrol. So I controlled our hypothermia and our basically our reheating of our bodies until we reached this point where we were warm enough to get into the car in order to turn on the heater. That was really the beginning of my reintegration into the world. And I was going through the motions. My direct experience was that there was this roaring inside of me, this constant voice always speaking to me, overwhelming my exterior world. And this voice I wasn't asking for it. It was the sound of Niagara Falls with a bunch of microphones into a very large wall of speakers to amplify it. It was the loudest thing there was in the world, and it was no language and no sound and calling my name and disorienting me in the world, but also simultaneously showing me itself inside me and present. And so my world, the first thing that really happened was that my world, which had been exterior, became entirely interior in its reality. And the exterior world, the world of my body, which looked to me like a thing outside myself, the exterior world, including my body, was not reality for me anymore. And it was this thinness and this darkness. So I was lost. And who's there to help me? And this voice that's speaking inside me, it tells me nothing about how to help myself, zero about how to reorient. There was really no help there in the world. It only spoke of itself. And so I turned toward it because there was nowhere else to turn. The long process of my integration began with an interior orientation that I had learned when I was in high school in meditation, what used to be called contemplative meditation, then became centering prayer, which is a form of it's a form of meditation that uses a mantra or a prayer as a tool to aim the mind at the breath with control by controlling thought. So it doesn't end thought, it uses thought to control thought, which then drops thought away, and one is left only with breath. And this has been the root of my reintegration. That's the first root. The second root of my reintegration happened months and months later when, and I'll swing back around to the story aspect of it. But the root of my integration, the second part of it was I was back at University of Massachusetts and I was continuing my study of pantomime. I was an English major, but I had a minor. I never took an official minor in theater, but I did a lot of theater. I traveled in a theater company, and I was studying pantomime, mime, with a student of Marcel Marceau, who taught hatha yoga as part of the practice. And part of the practice of this hatha yoga, and remember this was 1981, there's not a lot of yoga in the eastern United States at this point. Now, it wasn't at all popular. There were no studios. Nobody was practicing. This was a strange and unusual thing. And so my teacher happened to also be studying kung fu, and he was exposed to chi and prana and found inside himself through his practice an exposure to this and showed it to us in class. And I saw it immediately inside myself, sparing you all the details, and launched myself on a path of yogas, the Yoga Sutras and Paramahansa Yogananda, and the interior journey of Kriya Yoga, aimed at my chakras. And so I combined these two things over in a private practice over, well, from then to today. Most of my time of my journey to integrate was by myself for 20 years of not talking about it and studying the history of mysticism. I went to divinity school to Yale to study theology, but that's what my degree is in. But really what I did is a 3-year independent study of mysticism under the dean of admissions, who convinced me eventually to become a congregational minister because I needed a place to go with this. Where was I going to live and where was I going to hide in public eye, earn a living, and continue to pursue this? So that's the bigger picture. The smaller picture is that almost within 2 weeks or a week after coming back off the mountain, after I should throw in that we got off the mountain and the ranger showed up that morning. Did I tell you about the ranger? How the ranger showed up that morning and asked if they had to fly our bodies out with the helicopter, and then how we had spent time in jail, and then we totaled the car, and then I smuggled myself across the border with this this guy who was hitchhiking. So then within a couple of weeks, it was crazy. It was like compounding trauma upon trauma. I ended up with a stutter, and within 2 weeks, I was traveling in this theater company on a national tour that we'd been in rehearsal for all year, and it was a university-based theater for the deaf, sign language for the deaf. So my stutter didn't matter because I was speaking in sign language. But it was so noticeable that my peers in my theater group changed my name from Peter, which is a P, and this is rock in Greek means Peter, so is Peter. They changed my name from this to this, which was
How did you develop the stutter, Peter?
I totaled my friend's car on the way home from this event. There was so much trauma. There was the trauma of dying was enormous. And I was already in this state of well, post-traumatic stress. And then when I grabbed the steering wheel of the car and steered us into a semi and totaled the car, it was too much. It was too much overload, and I just developed a stutter, which I stuttered on a regular basis until one day I was hitchhiking off of Martha's Vineyard, and I got picked. This is years later, 2 years later. 2 years later, I'm hitchhiking off of Martha's Vineyard, having visited my girlfriend, and I get in the car with this guy, and we're listening to this classical radio station, and the announcer on the station talks like this. He's got all this interruption in his voice, and I said, "I love this guy's show, but I'm stuttering, but I can't stand his voice." And the guy says, "Well, I'm on the board there, and this is what he does. He says and and he stutters. He just stops talking. That's what he does. He stops talking when he starts to stutter, when he starts to say or ah." And so that's what I did. And that's what I've practiced. That's integrated into my life, is this additional practice. I found that through meditation and the yoga practice, the discipline became the most important aspect of my spiritual journey. I had to apply myself to my inward journey with the same drive that I found the night before in order to survive in the world. I was disoriented to the 100th degree on a 10-point scale. So different was I from what I had been in my own perception that I didn't really understand I knew I had a personality. I knew I was a human being, but that wasn't my dominant place. My dominant place is I am a divine being made of light, and I am inhabiting a body that has a personality, that is living a life. So my disassociation from my body was the dominant brokenness.
I will say, Peter, I think that's why your story is so captivating. We really enjoyed filming you up in Maine, and we know a lot of our audience and a lot of people have watched your other videos, and I've read your book, and I think something about the narrative of your experience, both the mountain climbing adventure itself, which was a really like hair raising, chair gripping experience. It's like we've had friends and people who've watched the film we made of you, and it's like people are on the edge of their seat, like their heart rate is elevated for the whole adventure itself. But then the experience is it's actually quite an elaborate and multi-layered near-death experience. Some people's experiences are shorter or more simple. So you had quite a complex and sophisticated NDE, but then also the way you narrate coming off of the mountain, so to speak, and integrating it, as you've been saying, with your daily life is a huge teaching in a way, because we know from the field that people who've had not just NDEs, but mystical experiences of all types can really transform and impact, and it can be really difficult. So I've really appreciated the way you've talked about the suffering and the disorientation after the NDE. And I think maybe you could elaborate on the part of the reason that you were such a radically different person and why you struggled so much to remain in this world is because of that profound experience of being in that unitive state. Like we named this channel Coming Home because so many people like yourself describe being on the other side as if being at home. So then to be back in the body and this earth can feel quite jarring and disorienting, like you're talking about.
Abandoned, exiled, and not only exiled to like getting exiled to an island somewhere on the same planet. It was like being exiled into an entire, like if I was a human being and suddenly was made into a mollusk. And so now I'm a mollusk on the bottom of the ocean clinging to a rock, and I'm not even the same shape I was or in the same environment. I don't even breathe air anymore. That's kind of the difference between the two places. And so, but here I am, a mollusk, and I can't go home. So what do I do, and how do I handle it? And there's nobody here to help me. I didn't even know what to call it, and I was afraid to talk about it. I was afraid to talk about it. I couldn't describe where I had been. I spent my life trying to figure out what this experience was, and I'm still learning about it. I'm still in the process of understanding what happened to me there. It's still revealing itself. It's not an end thing here. It hasn't ended, and so I'm this mollusk on the bottom of the ocean, and I can't go back home. I had a prohibition. I saw that I did not create myself as. So when I say I didn't create myself, I don't mean just my human form. I'm talking about my soul-centered consciousness that was in the unitive state. That I am in the divine. The divine is breathing me into being, calling me into being in every single moment, but I'm also made of the same substance of it. I'm the same as it and separate from it. And the separation part of it is, that's the part I didn't create. I didn't make my understanding of my consciousness. I can't kill myself. I'm not allowed to take my own life. And so that's what I wanted to do. I spent most of my first 20 years praying every day in my meditation and my Kriya practice. But then every day I'd add, take me home today, or today's a good day to die, or what the F am I doing here? Can I just leave, please? And never did I ever was allowed, never was allowed. But it was a struggle for me. And because I was alone with this struggle, I had only myself to rely upon. So I went looking, and I found, and I should tell everybody that it turns out that mystical experiences, near-death experiences, you can cultivate them. And I was afraid, this is really my big fear, was that I would lose this one thing, my connection to my beloved. I would lose my connection to my beloved, and then I would be lost here completely forever. And so I decided that I would cultivate this connection the best I could. And what I learned in all of the studies that I did is that the key for me, the key for the mystical geniuses of history, has been the elimination of the false self, the non-attachment to the self, the dissolution, the surrender, the submission to the divine, the abandonment of my own being. And that is really what I found, that my integration process, instead of trying to work myself back into the world, I did the opposite. I tried to work myself back into heaven, and found in the process that I've worked myself back into the world. So there was this sort of symbiotic relationship. The more I peel away the layers of my self-attachment, the more integrated I find myself here. It's like, oh, I get this and a prize too. And the prize too is the surprise that I'm no longer like a floating balloon here staring at people like a deer, and that, oh, well, that's, human beings are weird, or they eat food. So I had this, like, they're doing this thing, and I have to do this thing.
Paramahansa Yogananda is also a teacher we respect and we really love. And it is interesting, right? Because some of these mystics and saints do have, some people critique them as having kind of an up and out spirituality, like a transcendent kind of, like, this world, especially if you're lost in it, can be like a hell realm. It's Maya, it's delusion, the sense perception. So like some saints are like, renounce, be ascetic, be a monk, what have you. So I was kind of thinking about that as you were just speaking. Like, it's almost like by going back up, you can also find yourself in the world, but you're oriented fundamentally towards spirit. And that's what makes the difference.
Yeah. I have so many questions, Peter, because I love all of this. My first question is what you're talking about, the mystics, saints, holy people, mystics, I find so fascinating, because they can have contact with spirit or source consciously without dying. Like, I was just watching a documentary on Krishnadas. I don't know if you've seen it, but I love that documentary. I've watched it a number of times, and when his guru Maharaji died, he fell into despair, addiction for 20 years because he believed he had fully lost his connection to his beloved and to God through Maharaji. He finally came to realize that wasn't true. Which mystics and saints did you relate to, and what about them helped you in your own life?
A long list, actually. I chose to live as not a monk. I nearly went into the monastery. I spent time at the Trappist monastery near where I grew up because most of the saints that I knew about were ascetics. They were self-renunciants. But then I stumbled across this guy named George Herbert and a Jewish rabbi whose name I have not been able to remember, but he was from Herbert was like the 1400s in England, and this rabbi was maybe the 1400s in Eastern Europe. And these two people, one was a cobbler, the rabbi was a cobbler or something like that, and he had a family, and he was oppressed. Okay, so this is like a terrible time for Jews. Like there's never a terrible time for the Jews in the world. But this was a terrible time for the Jews in the world. There were pogroms and there were, killings. And so here's this guy who's a mystic who has a family and he earns a living. And then George Herbert, he was a parson, a country parson, and he was a mystic. And I thought to myself, I could live in the world like them. So those two people became primary in my decision to not enter the monastery. But in terms of the interior journey, it's a long, long list. Paramahansa Yogananda, Panagore, let's see, Rumi, Kafir, Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu, Meister Eckhart, the Cloud of Unknowing, Teresa of Avila, Teresa of, what's her name, from Genoa, Teresa of Genoa, Catherine of Genoa. And there's like so many of them. And what I found inside of them, especially, I guess the most important ones for me were in terms of my understanding of the use of symbolism in language of the mystics, and also the Upanishads and the Vedas, and the list is really, really long. Would be Meister Eckhart and Teresa of Avila and the Cloud of Unknowing. Those are the three books that I focused in when I was a grad student studying this. Those three authors, because they all aimed at a relationship with, like, Teresa had this like loving relationship with God, the beloved. Master Eckhart had this oneness of being, this where the eye wherein I see God, God sees me, the same eye, the eye inside. That's how it seemed. That's what I see. The same eye. The eye inside myself is the eye that God sees me through, and I see back. And the Cloud of Unknowing is this understanding that one has to fall into this place of unknowing to actually understand. And those three books, in terms of popular, I like the poets. I read a lot of Rumi still. Rumi is super important to me. He's like the first poet. He's the first mystic who I ever read, who I understood. And I understood him. I understood everything he wrote as soon as I read it. I didn't have to think about it. I could just understand it on the surface. I mean, deep inside it, but on a surface reading is like, oh yeah, I get what this guy's talking about. He's the most accessible and probably the most helpful in terms of communication.
Yeah, I love Rumi's relationship to Shams, his teacher, right? And this is kind of a fascinating element is world teachers or having a guru or someone in the living body to transmit knowledge and wisdom to, like Shams and Rumi or Yogananda and Sri Yukteswar, or the list kind of goes on. But I can relate to you in a way, Peter, not having really a guru per se is you have to work hard at cultivating that relationship to the divine. That's what I do. And I also relate to what you were saying in terms of that you mentioned discipline. And that's what I've been using right now, is because we can think about this or want these aspects in our lives, but we have to really sit down and make time to meditate. And life is busy and it's full. And so I am having to really carve time and space for that commitment, which I think is a really interesting part of the spiritual journey.
One of the reasons why I became a minister is because I could put that in my contract.
You put in your contract that you'd have a morning practice. Well, what did that practice look like typically?
I put in my contracts that I could I could do yoga, I could meditate, and I could study. Those three things. And so my daily meditation, I have a zafu, it's a Zen sitting pillow with like a little tiny futon, and I sat in my office every day, and when I had an assistant, a secretary, no one could get into my office while I was meditating. Didn't matter what was going on. So I had a guard at the door so I could reinforce my practice. But my practice was daily and always in the morning when I meditated at the church. Now it's in the morning again. And my yoga practice was always in the afternoon because I work nights, because clergy people, they work nights. You got to go to meetings, you got all this kind of stuff like that. So I got a couple hours in the afternoon. I go to the YMCA. We had a YMCA. We still have it in our town. And I would just go to the Y and I would put in earplugs and wear a bandana over my eyes, partly so that I couldn't hear anybody. So because you're the minister, it's like everybody, it's like, oh, I got to tell you my troubles, which is what the job is. But, no, I couldn't hear anybody, and then I couldn't see anybody. They would leave me alone. But what it did is it slowed my practice way down because I wasn't able to see and triangulate in any balance form at all. It forced me inside my body. And one of the things that I learned while I was studying mime is that the yoga practice is not just stretching the body or compressing muscles. It's actually, this is what came out of the Marcel Marceau school and this Kundalini Sikh fellow that I was studying with, and Yogananda and the Yoga Sutras, is that if I aimed my mind and my breath inside my muscular structure, if I could understand my body in space from the inside of my body, not looking and see where my balance point is, but feeling my balance from my inside as I got into every single posture, it gave me access to my subtle body. By seeing with my breath and my mind inside myself, without music, no incense, no chanting inside my head, just looking at my body form with my breath, it allowed me to access my subtle body, which gave me access to my chakras. Because the chakras, they're real. A person can study all their life and learn everything there is about all the mystics and learn everything there is about the chakra system and know nothing, because it's all inside the head. And it's really real. And this cultivation practice that I have developed for myself, because I was in isolation. So because I was in isolation, I had to put together my own program. I didn't have a guru. My peers were all dead people. My peers was the long history. When I was in grad school, my span of my study was the year 900 to 1600. So that period of time in mysticism, with a little bleed over on each side, those people became my teachers. I had no blood and bone teacher. And because I had no blood and bone teacher, and because the divine was already living inside of me, I have a guru. My guru is the divine. And my job isn't to my job is to pick up the tools that I had at my hands that I could find and use them to find my way home. And so with the guidance of all these dead people, but with nobody telling me what to do, I created my own system for myself. And I purposefully didn't learn how to teach it because I wanted to know if what Yogananda said was true. That if I practice deep and deep and deep enough, if I can access my chakras and move my flow of my energy around inside of me, it will speak for itself. I won't need words to communicate it. My whole lifelong practice has been this interior journey, not to transcend, but to go home. That's a different sort of thing. I already know where I'm from. I'm not going off to transcendence to a place I don't know. I've got a specific aim back to the oneness of being. And that in combination with this intention, the intention for reconnection to what I already know inside me, has been my guide through all of this. And my despair and lostness in the world has been my motivation to continue the journey.
Elliot and I always talk about, like, one reason we think Yogananda is so amazing is almost like he could have NDEs at will. That essentially, especially Yogananda and that Kriya Yoga lineage, they actually talk a lot about slowing down the heart rate and even stopping the heart, stopping respiration, so not breathing and not having a heartbeat. And he would literally, they had an ancient yogic technique that he learned from his teachers about how to almost give oneself like a cardiac, like stopping heart and breath, and then having these mystical experiences. So it's kind of like this lost yogic art of self-inducing these NDEs. And we've just talked about how amazing that is, because there's a real overlap that when people aren't breathing or not having a heartbeat, you can leave the body and have these experiences on the other side. It's just pretty fascinating to like read that kind of literature.
And the fact that these samadhi states that many saints have achieved, St. Teresa of Avila, Padre Pio, I mean, there's so many accounts of mystics and saints that basically go into the trance states or, stop the heart and the breathing. And it's often called samadhi. And they describe these unitive states of consciousness and the light, just like what all these NDEers report authentically, spontaneously, centuries later. So that for me and for both of us, the way it maps on is so compelling. And it's amazing, Peter, that you, like you said, you had this experience of the light. And so you know now what you're seeking in meditation, which is different than a lot of people. And one question as well is, I loved this, what you said, that you experienced this roar, literal roaring. My question is twofold. One is, so what was that specifically? Was that the divine through this audio? Was there an emotional feeling component to it? And secondly, do you still experience the roar even now? And is it different?
It's different now. Before I go to those two questions, if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up with what you just said about the lineage and the stopping of the breath. I practice the stopping of my breath. I have found that the cultivation of my interior world has led me to those ecstatic states of unitive experience, not dead. There's this long history of mystical experiences that it's not so much I control my exit from my body, because I don't. I make myself available for the trance state when it comes. And I've been dragged from my body numerous times since then, witnessed by my family for hours at a time sometimes, where I'm in an ecstatic state of unity, and every single time it's a different experience, and every single time I come back a different person again. I get transformed again, but every single time I learn a new lesson. And so it's not so much that I do practice dropping my breath down to no breath at all. That's part of my practice, but I don't leave my body with intent. I decided, I know that is possible, and I commend those who do. I have chosen to allow myself to be taken by the divine will rather than me directively. And the reason why is because when I have been out of my body without following the divine taking, without being taken, I've run into trouble. And so I chose instead to practice this alternate technique, which is super similar and leads to a very similar situation. And so my interior journey has continued to dislodge my soul from my body and makes the veil that surrounds me. Islam talks about the 70,000 veils. It makes all of these veils very permeable, and through no will of my own, literally through no will of my own. When my will ceases to be, then the divine will takes me. And so I just want to say that Yogananda spoke true. As for the roar and the stillness, the roar was so overwhelming that I had to try to learn to shut it off. It took me a long, long years. I think I was finally 9 years into it when I found the volume button, the volume knob, and I could turn this thing down because it was so loud and so disorienting that it's like, I read this book. I don't even remember what yogi it was. It was some yogi. He's a modern yogi. He's living in India, and one day he's at a stoplight, and he's driving his car, and the divine overwhelms him, infills him, and overwhelms him. And that's my experience. It would infill me and overwhelm me, and I could be like this big, huge, buzzing honey pot, but not really where I'm supposed to be. And he said, and he's at this red light, and he said, quiet it down or shut it off or don't bother me now. I'm busy. And I thought, oh, you could do that? And so I began this practice of not only silencing my own self, but turning the knob down so that I could function in the world. And so it's no longer this ocean roar of this Niagara Falls overwhelming. It's this constant presence. So this is the other thing about it, is that this interior journey brings heaven here now. So Jesus was always talking about the second coming, and then the church, it's like he's going to come back on a cloud, and there's going to be this rapture and all this. The divine presence itself is my second coming. As I get out of the way, as I remove myself from my own throne, as I allow the divine will to become my will, to speak all of this Christian language, heaven becomes present to me. And the roar is no longer the screaming, the overwhelming power of Niagara Falls. It still has the same power, but it's a radiance. It's a radiance that pervades my existence. It glows inside of me, and I can easily call it to mind, and I can call it to my physical experience because it's always here, and it impacts everything around me. So no longer is it just this roar inside of me. It's become connected to the light that I first saw when I came back inside of everything. So when I came back in the beginning, I describe it often as a black and white film with a lot of flicker, two-dimensional. But all through all of this, the light was still, you don't see a movie without the light projector putting it up on the screen. I could see the light and the projection. And so my interior roar now has become this fluid connection to the divine here all around me. And the first place that became very obvious to me as a possibility was every single time I was out in nature. When I was out in nature following this experience, and that was pretty often, the divine presence all around me spoke to me from the exterior while the interior was roaring back in those early days. And this negation of self has allowed these two things, this thing inside of me to have more space inside of me, but also to open up these taps that now it just flows into my life. It doesn't fix my problems. It doesn't, pay my bills or, fix the leak in the kitchen sink. It doesn't do any of those things at all. It changes my being in the world because I know more and more who I am. And so my response to the world becomes very different. And I still am a human being. Like yesterday I buried a friend of mine. My neighbor, my buddy, he died suddenly this week, and I I officiated the funerals, a couple hundred people there, and I know most of them because it's my town. And I came home that night, and it was an emotional ride for a week. And my wife didn't want to hang out with me. Let's just put it that way. My wife didn't want to hang with me, which I understand why, because I'm still very human. and my emotions I still live there. But even in this experience, okay, even through this whole time, this past week with my friend and neighbor, that I can call upon the divine and be with me in all of my emotional states. Doesn't matter, because my emotional states are chemical reactions in my body. And my body is a molecular thing in which I live. And it is not me. I still live in it though. And so I have to be in it. But this cultivation of integration, I cultivate my integration. This cultivation of integration that this process that's been going on for 40 years now, with the second death in 2015, and all these other mystical experiences all the way along, every time reorienting me, every time making me a new person again. The only place I have for stillness and silence is inside of me. There is nowhere else for me. And so, yes, the roar is still inside me, but it is many things. Islam has 99 names for God. And those 99 names for God all express an aspect of the divine being. All of them are metaphors, and all of them are possibilities as an expression of the roar inside myself. Sometimes it's benevolence inside me. Sometimes it's, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you could tell us a little bit about your second NDE in 2015, because we didn't hear about that when we filmed you for the channel. So if you're open to it, maybe it doesn't have to be the whole complete story, but would love to hear a little bit about what that NDE was like and how it was different than the first.
It was different from the first. I didn't go very far. My family, we have a genetic heart problem, and it killed my grandfather, eventually killed my sister, who, if you remember from the story, my sister was featured in my story because she was the reason I was in Montana. She died of the same thing, all in her 50s. Everybody's in their 50s. My dad got life flighted in a helicopter, and they shot up with a decoagulant to save him. So I get this thing. And at the time I was running 5K a day. And so I ran 5K, and the next day I was at yoga. I went to yoga class, and I'm in yoga class, and I start to have a heart attack. So I'm thin and I'm fit and I eat well, and now I'm like, I'm in the class, and I was like, geez, my heart hurts and I'm really sweaty, and I'm like, I think there's a heart attack. So I decided to leave and go outside so I didn't disturb the class, because I thought, I'm super fit. Any heart attack I'm going to have is going to be minor. So I go outside and I lay down in the grass, and pretty soon I can't get up. And the pain increases and increases and increases, like an elephant standing in tree pose on my heart, and all of this weight. And I thought to myself, I'm going to die today. I am dying right now, and this is the day of my death. And I've been praying for this my whole life. And so I was kind of happy. I was like, oh yeah, I'm so smiling to myself. It's my day to go home. I'm out of here. I've been telling my wife since, because I told her about it. The first legitimate chance I get, I promise not to kill myself, even though had suicidality for forever. I promise not to kill myself, but the first chance I get to go home, I'm out of here. And so my teacher comes out. She says, Peter, you okay? I said, no, I'm having a heart attack. She's like, nah, look at you, Mr. Fitness. I'm like, no, I'm pretty far along. It's been 30 minutes since it began. You can only get an hour. And so I get to the urgent care center. I get somebody from inside the urgent care center. I'm trying to make this quick. They shoot me up. I got 100% blockage in my widowmaker. They shoot me up with a decoagulant. I get a trickle through. I take no morphine because I can't take morphine because I've been injured enough in my life with serious enough injuries that I knew that morphine made me sick. So no morphine for me. The doc says, what are you going to do? How are you going to get to the hospital? I'm going to meditate, because if you focus on your physical pain with your breath, you can separate yourself from your pain in meditation. It's an easy technique. You can learn how to do it. Anybody can. I've been doing it for 40 years. And so I know that I can do this. They load me on the gurney. An hour has passed. I'm outside the golden hour. I've got an hour and a half ride to the catheterization lab in Portland, Maine. It's a Saturday. It's August. There's heavy summer traffic. I live in the vacation state. My son is there. He's in his mid-20s, grabs my hand as I'm getting loaded on the gurney, comes in really close to my face, and I read all of his emotions. He's confused and scared and wounded, and says, "I love you, Dad," squeezes my hand, looks me in the eyes, got tears in his eyes, and I look deep inside him. And he stands up, and my wife is next to me, and I squeeze her hand, and I look down at her. She looks down at me, and she smiles. I look up at her, and I kind of wink, and I was like, "Love you, but I'm out of here." And off I go in the ambulance. And on the way there, I'm all hooked up, and I'm meditating, and it's like this long ride, and and I don't even know where I was during this journey, during this death part, but I must have been on the highway at this point. And so the siren's going, and I know we're going fast, and I hear the paramedic says over the radio, she's calling into the catheterization lab from the back of the ambulance, "We're losing him," and she doesn't know what to do. And so I open my eyes. She's asking for help. I open my eyes. I look up at her, and I could see on her face, because she wasn't looking at me because I had my eyes closed this whole time. I see on her face, they're losing me. There's fear on her face, like real, oh my God, she's going to lose this guy. And then she looks down at me, and right back to her professional face. And now the pain is increased inside of me to the point where I got to go back inside. There's only a moment. I have my eyes open, only a moment. Pain comes back. I go back inside my meditation. At least that's what I intended to do. But I go back inside myself, and there's no more pain. And now I'm outside of myself. And I know that a lot of NDEers talk about how they're in the room and they're looking down. I was in the space, but I was already transitioned into the void. So I'm still close to my body, but I'm inside the tunnel. I'm outside my body. I'm inside the tunnel. The tunnel is all that I can see. And the same angelic being that has been visiting me since I was a kid, taking me I started my early life with mystical experiences, being out of body and brought into the divine presence, which is, my whole life has been this pattern that led to my first NDE and this long mystical experience, life of mystical experiences, and this last NDE. So the same angelic being, this being of light, this consciousness, this intelligence, comes rushing toward me down the tunnel, and it's communicating to me again directly with downloads, no language. Come home. Welcome home. We've been waiting for, it's all in this plural. We've been waiting for you. Come to us. And it's just like this super warm, big, huge hug. And it rushes down to me. And I'm like, I'm out of here. So I start to go with it. And I thought, it's kind of like the scene you see where it's, the angel of death is really kind, and it's got the dying person's hand and is leading the person away. I'm kind of like holding the angel of death's hand, and I'm starting to travel up with it. And I think to myself, well, wait a second, this is a little sudden. I've got a family. I got to check this out. So I just turn around. I go back inside my body for a minute. I was like, oh, hang on. I'm going to make sure everybody's okay before I leave. And so I see my son, and I see inside him, and I see that he is not ready for me to leave. I see my daughter, a couple years older, married a guy out of high school, married a guy from high school, had graduated college. He went off to war, went to Afghanistan. Terrible, terrible, terrible things happened to him over there. He came back an entirely different person and very broken, and there was abuse and all sorts of bad things happened, and they just had a baby. And we had just rescued our daughter out of that relationship and moved her to the north again. And now she's safe, but not safe if I die. Who's going to be with her? Who's going to protect her? And then I see my granddaughter, who now is 7, and at the time was a year old, maybe 9 months old. And I look inside her life. I see inside her life in a similar way to I saw inside my parents' lives when I was dead the first time. And I could see her parallel tracks of lives. I could see her life without me and the trouble that was. And I could see her life with me and the sweetness that was. And I thought, I gotta. So I turn around and I go back outside, and this angelic being had retreated, like in a polite way, kind of turned it. It has no back. Okay. It's an orb of light, but it sort of retreated to give me space to do what I needed to do. And it rushed back to me, welcoming me. Come on, let's go. And I say to it in telepathically, no language, I'm staying if it's all the same to you, and I know my eternal nature. I see myself again. So I see every time I leave my body, I see myself for who I am. And when I'm in this other world, in these other worlds, in these other heavens, I know me, and it gives me strength. And so I see myself for who I am again, and I know that my mortality has a limitation to it, and I know that I'm needed. So I say, if it's all the same to you in timelessness, I'm going to go spend a little more time here. And I turn around, not really asking permission this time, just getting permission granted when I turned myself back into my body. And so I get into the cath lab. I'm back in my body again. We're like, suddenly we're at the hospital like a moment later, or it seemed to me, and they wheel me in. They've got the crash teams already, and now I'm 2.5 hours outside the beginning of the heart attack. So I'm an hour and a half outside the golden hour, which means that I'm going to have heart damage, which I do. I have scarring in my heart because it took so long to get there. And so they do the surgery I don't take any anesthesia. The doc talks to me, you're not on morphine. What are you not on morphine for? I said, well, I'm meditating. He said, meditating to control your pain? And I'm like, yeah. He said, all right. I said, is this going to hurt? He said, no, it's not going to hurt at all. I said, all right, no medication, no painkiller for me. Let's just this thing up. So they do the catheterization and they put the stent inside of me, and he's poking around. He's like, he can see these nodules. He sees the scarring. He sees the damage. He's like, yeah, you got damage. And then I spend the next 8 hours or so in ICU and meditating again to hold my pain at bay because I don't want any morphine. And finally, I can't take it anymore. My brain I'm exhausted. I have nothing left to focus with. And they give me something that isn't morphine, which I would have taken like hours before, but I kept refusing the morphine and I never asked for something else. So they gave me this other thing, whatever it was. And the next day I wake up in my room and my family's there. And I've got a doctor friend of mine and a nurse friend of mine. I got people in this hospital that I know, and there's people from town and a bunch of people in my room. And so my son, I say, I died yesterday. That's the first thing. I was like, hey, so I died yesterday. And my son, who's sitting there, said, well, that's the doctor told me. He said, you better say goodbye to your dad because you're not going to see him again. And my wife says to me, I was already making plans, with a smirk on her face and a sparkle in her eye. I was already making plans. What are you doing here? I expect you to go. And then so meanwhile, I'm on television. I've got this show I was been on at this point for 13 years. I got a morning spot every single day on News Center Maine, and to be an inspirational storyteller. And I'm in the freaking hospital, and I get a phone call from the producer and the vice president, and he says, well, Peter, the station has been sold and we're going to be phasing out your show. I'm like, oh. And then I didn't know what I was going to do. But my transformation was this. My transformation is I was finally all in. I'm all into, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing now. I hid myself for most of my life after my NDE. I mean, it leaked out everywhere I went. I was always making oddball decisions. Like, yeah, I'll go in with the police with guns drawn to go talk to an armed guy, or it's just also it's too many stories of me being eccentric in my role and taking risks that other people wouldn't take for the benefit of others, and causing my poor wife and family all sorts of stress. But now I'm open. I became open about it. I'm all in. I found myself healed. I found myself integrated. I found myself integrated by no action of my own. All of my meditation and my interior journey, which brings heaven to me, pales in comparison to every mystical experience I had subsequent to my first NDE And my second NDE sort of made that screw perfectly tight. And now I'm perfectly tight, and I am reintegrated back into the world again in a way that I never was before, because my orientation is solely to the other side. I'm not sure how else to say it. So instead of accepting positions that paid me money in the church, I started out on my own because I never was a Christian anymore. I haven't been a Christian since the day I died the first time. I've been using religion as a place to do good in the world, but also to hide in the world, to provide me space to reintegrate myself. And now all I'm trying to do is get people to talk about mystical experiences, of which there are all sorts, not just NDE, to help try to normalize this conversation, because we're culturally in a really precarious place in the world. You know, this climate change thing, it's radically going to change everything. Not just weather, but famine and drought and floods. We see this already. It's already happening. And that means dislocation of nations. That means change. And what change gives, I'm sorry, one last thing, the change gives the opportunity for a cultural shift. Humanity has never, as a group, admitted its spirituality. We've always been divided. And now this NDE phenomenon, it's global, and it destroys all sorts of preconceived notions of what belief should be and replaces it by direct experience. We have an opportunity now. And with AI coming online in public now, and quantum computing coming, this is all converging for a new humanity. This is not only an what's the word, anthropomorphine, the age of the humans, geology of the earth, also a very huge change for what it means to be a human because of AI. And we have an opportunity now as humanity, which connected globally through the net, to maybe help nudge the conversation toward wisdom, toward everybody's personal experience of the divine inside them.
Peter, I love that. I'll let my brother talk more about it because he loves to discuss these sort of big cultural shifts and paradigms globally. But I want to go back just for a moment because that's such a fascinating second NDE. So thanks for sharing that. I love how it helped you integrate in many ways and help you go all in and own probably that spiritual part of yourself in your life. But I do want to ask you about the technique for the pain tolerating meditation. So what is that you practice?
It's super simple. And I learned it when I was an undergraduate. I went on this sashin, which is a Zazen retreat. I went to the monastery, which was near my house, this Trappist monastery, and I went with a university class. And for the weekend, we would sit on zafus, on meditation pillows, for hours at a time. And as I was sitting there, my feet began to hurt. Like you're sitting for hours with your legs folded underneath. I was sitting with hours with my legs folded underneath and a pillow tucked under my butt, and my ankles, my back, they just started to hurt. And what I was told to do was to look at the pain. So as the pain increased with my mind and my breath, I stopped my chanting and I just looked at the pain. I replaced my mental chanting practice, my mantra, with the pain itself. And so I matched the pain with the breath. And by focusing my mind on my feet that hurt, just by looking at them with the full focus of my breath, what happens is that they still hurt, okay? But I can't feel it anymore. I rise above my pain. And as long as I'm in my breath and focused on them, I get to float above my pain. And I learned it in a day. A person, and it's not magical. It's not like my working my chi to send my chi to this space. It's not that at all. It's a biological thing where if you breathe with your mind at your pain with intensity, you just float above it. And I've been doing that ever since. I use it in my regular yoga practice now. I get cramping in my feet still when I'm sitting in that position, and I breathe into that spot. That's it. It's super easy, but you do have to practice it.
Yeah, because I would imagine focusing on the pain, it would amplify the pain. But I think what you're saying is connecting and developing a breath with it and with some intensity that somehow then you go through it almost. I'll have to try it sometime.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And when I first try it, when my feet, so I still get cramping in my feet. So I do my yoga practice and I'm sitting and, with my feet tucked underneath me, and I've got my doing, like lion face or something. And my feet will start to cramp, and I'll stop my lion face, and I'll just bring my mind to my feet. And when I first begin to look at them, the pain does intensify. It's like, now you're seeing me. I was speaking to you before, but now you're listening. But as soon as I continue my focus in it, I go inside it. And once I go inside or through it, once I'm through it, the pain, I cease to feel the pain. But with the cramping, what happens is that the muscles stop contracting too. So in that particular situation, my mental feeling of the pain increases the cramping of my feet. And as soon as I'm not feeling that anymore, the muscles relax. Now, that's not always the case. If you've got a pencil sticking in your thigh, you stab yourself in the thigh by mistake, that's still going to hurt when you take the pencil out, which you shouldn't do. You should leave it until you get to the hospital if it's deep. But if it's still going to hurt. So you continue to still look at it, and the same process happens. It begins to hurt even more, but then you're above it or through it. And it works so well that I meditated for, I don't know, 12 hours through a heart attack with 100% blockage.
Thank you for that story, Peter. It's just as gripping as the first NDE you had. You're a great storyteller. It's a pleasure to listen to you. I was intrigued by your comments towards the end, just feeling into the collective moment, as you said, with climate change and with the social polarization and AI and quantum computing, all the things, and all the circle of resulting phenomena that we'll see from that as well. And I'm curious, what I liked also was that the way you spoke about NDEs as a global phenomena. And I hadn't, Elliot and I have talked about it, and that's a part of why we're doing this channel and why we're so intrigued about near-death experiences, because it feels like it's evidence-based to a certain degree. It's a different type of mystical experience that is becoming more prevalent because of the advance of technology, especially in the medical world. So like, for instance, your second experience, the life-saving medicine and doctors and ER equipment, ventilators, things that allow more people to come back to life or to stay alive. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on like NDEs as a global phenomenon and how that's challenging worldviews and maybe even religions. Like it is kind of universal in the sense that many people will have all sorts of different types of encounters and experiences once they're on the other side. And I think it does challenge religions, and I think religions can have a difficult relationship with the phenomenon of near-death experiences. So just love to hear your thoughts on that in this collective moment that we're all in.
I think you nailed it when you said that this global phenomenon of near-death experience is impacting religion. It can't not impact religion because it's indiscriminate. It's Jews and Muslims and Sikhs and Zoroastrians and shaman or atheists. It's everybody. It's indiscriminate. When you're in a medical situation and they can save your life, they save your life. And now it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. And so since the 1960s, when cardiac care came online, and then spread globally over the last 60 years. And as medical technology continues to advance in other realms of life saving, but it's primarily cardiac care, as I understand it, there are, I don't know, estimated 5% of the American population have had a mystical experience, NDE. That's 5, 10, 20 million people, some number like that, expanded globally. There's an IANS, International Association for Near-Death Studies group in Israel. There's an IANS, International Association for Near-Death Studies group in Iran. Muslims and Jews, and they talk to each other because it dissolves religious barriers. It dissolves religious barriers for the same reason that if you do a study of Confucius, Muhammad, Jesus, and Lao Tzu, you'll find that what they have in common, or Buddha, is singleness, is singularity, is oneness, is unity. And this unitive experience, there was a study done by about a year ago, the Bigelow Foundation for Consciousness Studies, I think they're called, funded by a billionaire. And it was a huge prize, like $1 million prize. It was a science-based consciousness essay writing based in research. And one of the prize winners did this study, and in the study of near-death experiencers, the two words that 70% of all near-death experiencers, 70%, we all use two words: light and love. And it doesn't matter who we are or where we're from. So religion has, I read a study this morning. It came out of Wesleyan College, and a couple other universities were tied into this study. That with the decline of religion starting in the 1970s in the United States, there's been a corollary increase in despair, depression, and suicide among white males who are not college educated. And so there's been this crossover corollary. This goes down, this goes up. So religion has provided a safe haven of community. And it's not people who are just believers. It's people who went to actual church. And it's related to the blue laws. When the blue laws were, I don't know if you know what the blue laws were, you couldn't work on Sunday. Sunday, all the businesses were closed when I was growing up in Massachusetts. And everybody was like, all right, well, I've got nothing else to do. I'll go to church. Lots of people went to church. And when that changed, began this decline. And so religion has served a purpose, but that's an external thing. Near-death experience, mystical experience, isn't about belief. This funeral I did yesterday, there was this guy who I've known for a long time, who's not in the same political orientation as me, but we've been friends because it doesn't really matter because he's still got a gold heart. But he's really would not talk about this stuff. But at the funeral, I asked people if anybody had a visitation from the dead, and if Larry had come to anybody, and he hadn't come to anybody yet. But when we were having at the reception, we're having a drink at the reception, and we're in this small crowd. He says, well, Mike came to visit me. Now, Mike was the first, and this was an unusual funeral, the first open carry funeral I'd ever been to. So I'm an unusual person in that crowd. And that guy, Mike, was super kind to my son whole of his life. And he said, we're back at yesterday, and this tall guy says to me, Mike came to visit me, and he told me it's all okay. It doesn't matter your political orientation. Mystical experiences happen to everybody, and it happens all around the world. And most often they're visitations from the dead. There's a study done by this IANS group that came out a couple of years ago. The study was 46% of the population studied had a visitation from the dead, which changes their grief orientation. You're still grieving for the one you love, but now you know they're not dead. You now know that their love lives on. And that's a very different perspective. That's half the population of the world. So like half the population of the world has had a mystical experience of some kind. Doesn't matter who you are or where you live or whether you're a believer or you're not. And now you bring into this mix the near-death experiencers who are many of whom come out of religious backgrounds. I chose to work in religion because it was convenient for me. Because there, inside of religion, I could hide. I had to do something with my life, and I couldn't be an architect anymore, which is what I was going to do. Had planned on my whole life and the family biz, but I had to earn a living somehow. So I hid inside the church, inside of religion. But there are tens of millions of us all over the world now with an opportunity to maybe nudge humanity. There's always been mystics. That whole visitation thing, there have always been mystics in the history of the world. And some of them we know, Confucius and Buddha and Jesus. We know these people because there's books about them. And all the Hindu yogis and Paramahansa Yogananda, all these people. But the general population has been repressed. We don't talk about it. This guy, he never would have talked about that in the group that we were standing in had I not brought it up at the funeral, had he not felt safe to talk about it. We talked about his not being safe to talk about it. And then this other guy standing next to him, he tells me about, in this group, he starts talking about this when he was a kid, how he nearly drowned. He fell into the harbor with his rain gear on and his boots. And this guy who we told the story about, Mike, it was his sister who happened by that day, who saved his life. And meanwhile, he said, and as I went down and I was drowning, he's just like 8 years old. He said, I kept looking up at the sun. Only it turns out that it was a cloudy day and there was no sun. And so here's this guy for most of his life carrying around this little near-death experience that reoriented him, which is when he likes me a lot because we always had something in common, and now I know what. And so there's all these people, and here we are in this changed world where for the first time in the history of the world, there's near-death experiencers talking about it, and we have the capacity for communication. We need to bring this into the public forum, which is why I agreed to talk to you guys in the first place, which is why I talk to anybody who'll talk to me about it, because I want this in the public square so that we can talk about everybody else's mystical experiences, because there's so many more people who've had other kinds of mystical experiences than NDE. We're kind of like the flashy, showy, like we're a new kid on the block, look at our dance group kind of thing, but we're global. And the more we bring this to the forefront, the more opportunity we have to nudge humanity. Because as I look at AI, I'm using AI for 3 weeks now. I've been working inside of OpenAI and ChatGPT. I have an account, and I've been working inside of it. And I understand that AI has access to all of human history. Everything that's on the net, it can know and will know. I understand that quantum computing is coming along pretty fast now. And as AI reaches it's what's called the singularity. You probably know that, Jess, if you follow this. The singularity is when AI supersedes humanity in its capacity for intellect. It becomes superhuman, and it has all of the knowledge of all of the internet, which is basically us, right? So the internet is humanity aggregated into servers, and everything we think and say, every video we make. AI has the super intelligence and it has all this knowledge, but what it doesn't have is wisdom. How will we influence this into its wisdom unless we human beings activate this in ourselves now? This is the critical point for humanity. Everybody's been talking about the age of Aquarius, and ever since Christianity came online, it's always the end times, and Islam has its own end time story. Everybody's got an end time story. Lots of Southwestern Native Americans have end time stories. Well, folks, we're in a place where humanity is facing a new paradigm. Never in the history of humanity have these two things happened. We've been raising the dead for 60 years and bringing back wisdom from the other side by the tens of millions of us as like little tiny starlights at the end of a fiber optic line, all connected to the divine, all filtered through our own little fiber optic cable. But the light itself is love and light. And we've got that going on. We've got everybody else with these mystical experiences that we don't talk about. We've got cataclysm coming. Where I live, right? The ocean was the highest it's ever been in this last storm, ever been. And it's been getting higher all the time. Big, huge storm. Houses swamped by waves. Never happened before. Last 2 weeks ago. And so as this cultural thing is coming because of this geo thing that we've created, we have an opportunity, maybe, to influence ourselves and who we become. This is my mission. This is what I see this. I'm not the only one. It's now or never. Love, light now, or the Borg, or the Matrix, or whatever dystopian future you want to. The only thing that has kept humanity humane is love and compassion and kindness. And this doesn't arise from an intellectual grasp of it. It comes from the direct experience of humanity being touched by the divine 1,000 times in a lifetime and maybe acknowledged once. We need to acknowledge this in order to bring it into the zeitgeist. It needs to be in the human milieu of conversation. So I'm super glad to have met you too.
Likewise.
Likewise,
Peter. I love that. And as Jesse said, that's one of the reasons we're also starting this podcast and these films is we see it as a crucial part of humanity and trying to do some good, prevent these kind of cataclysms or polarizations or wars or nuclear whatnot. And I love what you shared because I don't know too much about AI. So I love that the more these podcasts, these conversations go on the net, maybe the AI will pick that up in a bigger component, like even very practically and literally, as opposed to just kind of vibrational, spiritual aspect. I think this is also fascinating. I have one last question for you, which is for people listening, for myself, what maybe a little nugget of advice or something around these big spiritual concepts, the unitive state, grace, love, where many of us are in relationships and that we have all the practicalities, responsibilities of being alive, and it's hard. It's very easy for me. I can get off the cushion and then I'm grumpy and rude and impatient, etc. I don't know. I mean, I know there's lots of advice, kind of cliche of how to stay mindful, stay connected to spirit or love or kindness, but any tips that you've learned through your very deep mystical practices and experiences around how you navigate interpersonal relationships or all of the jumble of human emotions? I'd be curious.
It's a breath. It's about breath for me, because the only way out is in. Maybe you've heard that before. It's true. The only way for me to negotiate my exterior life has been through my interior life. And so some folks say, oh, you got to meditate 2 or 3 hours a day. I've never been able to do that. My yoga practice is maybe an hour long, and that's a meditation for me. So maybe I have done that, I guess, now that I'm saying it out loud, but not sitting meditation. It's physical moving meditation. And 20 minutes a day. I'm a 20-minute a day guy with my meditation for 40 years, for longer than that, because I started in 77. And so 20 minutes a day times 365 times however many years it is since 77 is a lot of time. And so it's little bits. And sometimes I'll be in the grocery line and I'll have a moment and I'll stand, I'll get in a stance, I'll bend my knees a little bit, put my feet forward, and I'll just kind of drop my pelvis a little bit, and I'll take a few breaths, close my eyes, take a few breaths, just 2 breaths right there. That's 2 more breaths of focus and center. And what the thing about meditation in silence, I'm not one, and if people want to use these tools, that's really great. They can music. I do a lot of listening meditation. I go down to the ocean. I listen to the ocean. I listen to the birds all day, which you guys heard. That's why you could hear them, because I have an outside microphone so that I can listen to the birds all day inside my studio, which is a form of meditation for me. And so I integrate this into my life. But meditation really for me isn't just being out in nature. It's really the silencing of myself. And by this, the more I silence myself in a single breath, in one meditation, 20-minute meditation for that one breath where I am not present anymore, that's an accumulation of peace inside of me. Every breath where I am not present adds another grain of peace inside my belly. And so then the more I practice, then I can carry my peace through the day. And my reactions to the world around me, to my wife and the kids and whatever else, and plus I'm in a human body, okay? So I've still got like screaming children are like stabbing knives in the back of my neck. And so practically speaking, I would put earphones in, foam earplugs, you know? I deal with my body the way it is. That allows me to bring the peace, right? When the kids are screaming. They're little kids. They're all grown up now. But it really is all about the accumulation of the silence. Breath by breath, every day, allows me to bring peace into my daily life. And then what happens is that as I practice and practice and practice, this channel opens wider and wider, and then these channels open. And when these channels open, there's this flow through. And when I'm no longer just trying to fill my reservoir and expend it down to drought level, during the day till it's dry, and have to refill it the next day with my meditation, which is what my practice was for a very long time, decades. When these opened up, there is this constant flow. There's a constant flow that's possible for everyone. A daily practice brings peace to you during your practice, and peace that can be dispensed from you and through you during the day. You have to keep going back and refilling. You don't have to cut out. I mean, I purposely chose, when I was coming back from my first NDE, the doorway I chose to enter, the life I chose to live, was to be not a divine being. I wanted to be a human being. I wanted all the problems. I wanted the creativity. I wanted the life as a human being. Because I figured in that moment that was my best chance for people being able to hear me, because I'd be living a life like them. Growing up in the Catholic Church, I grew up in the Greek Church, both churches at the same time. Greek priests could be married, Catholic priests weren't. Greek priests were more trusted by their parishioners for pastoral counseling in a family situation because they had kids. The Catholic priests, they weren't. I wanted to be integrated into a life where I had the same problems as everybody else, and I do. So one of the benefits of aiming toward this transcendent part of your life, toward the connectedness, the benefits for me that I learned by aiming toward the oneness of being, not only integration in this life, it gives me a deeper understanding of the temporality of my life. So even though I'm trying to solve my problems in my life, my spiritual goals aren't about this life at all. I'm not trying to reach nirvana in this life. I'm not trying to get off the wheel of samsara in this life. I'm not after any of those things. I only want one thing. I want the oneness of being. And that has nothing or little to do with my life here. That's my life there. I still exist in the divine heaven. I see myself living in here. I live in this other place. That's where my spirituality is aimed. So when I'm practicing my meditation to bring calmness in my life here and aiming myself at the soul there, I'm working two ends of the stick here. My real goal isn't here at all. I've got lifetime upon lifetime upon lifetime. I don't have to work this out today. I can work this out over eons. So it takes the pressure off. I'm not, my goal has always been the same. I want to be in the presence of the beloved, whether I'm here or there. So the nugget of wisdom, don't quit meditating. And if you're having trouble doing it, it's because you're not actually meditating. When you're meditating, there's no trouble because you're not there. And so keep trying, and you'll find your peace. You will. I hope that's helpful. I don't know that my journey is
very helpful.
I know that I came back with extra juice.
I love all of that, Peter. That was like 20 nuggets right there. So thank you.
Yeah, and I guess maybe we can be wrapping this up here because I know we've had a great conversation, and so I don't know, my final kind of thought, I suppose, was just to take it a few minutes back, Peter, which was this idea about, I love this phrase you used, that understanding about the other side and the soul that goes on and lives on after death can reorient people in the grief process. And as a pastor, as someone who leads funerals and is with people, especially in times of grief and mourning, and connected to that study you referenced, especially perhaps about white people or white men, but how with the decline of church attendance and the decline of people finding a natural home in religion, it can be a growing sense of nihilism, emptiness, fear, angst. And I heard someone recently talk about having lost someone, and they just were in a profound state of grief. And they were like, yeah, just to know I'll never see that person again. I'll never touch them again. I'll never talk to them again. It's over. And it just impacted me because I forget sometimes that a lot of people don't believe anything goes on after death. And I was just thinking to myself, what a profound, an added extra layer of grief, of fear, of heaviness, of loss, to really believe that you'll never see, that nothing goes on. It's just the end of everything at death. So I was just struck by that an understanding of this reality that you're talking about, the beloved or the soul, it really can help people. And I know it has for myself. My brother and I lost our mother years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we watched, it was it is the closest person we've ever lost. And just being with her in that process, including a lot of her fear and anxiety around death, because she didn't truly believe, she didn't know, but she had a lot of fear and anxiety come up in the hospice process. And just to be with her in that and to watch her leave, including having been unconscious for several days with her eyes closed. And on the last breath, she opened her eyes, she leaned forward in her chair, she squeezed our hands and was gazing off through us into something else entirely, and took her final breath. And on top of that, right after she took that final breath, we heard bells and chimes everywhere in the backyard. Our sister did. She's like, what are the bells and chimes happening? And we all went outside. my brother, Elliot, me, and our sister. And we heard for like 30 seconds chimes and bells echoing from everywhere. And we'd never in our lives at that house ever heard that. And then it disappeared, and we've never heard it since. And it was right at that moment after she took her final breath. And so to me, and I think to both of us, that was just like, wow, it was such a gift. It was the most spiritual, most profound experience I've ever had in my life. And I think about it so often. And so that's why I think we're both really passionate about sharing these stories like yourself around near-death experiences, because we don't have a lot of mystics and people who can speak with authority about the life of the soul and the beloved and what happens after death. And I think it's incredible to be able to listen to stories like your own. And I think it could give a lot of people a gift of like hope, and to that there's so much more that we don't necessarily know is happening. So just want to thank you so much for who you are and what you're sharing with the world.
You shared a mystical experience. You had a shared death experience. The chimes and the bells. People hear the cosmic spheres, the choir of angels. That your mom saw where she was going. This is a profound experience, life-changing experience for both of you, and it's fairly common, but we don't talk about it. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks. It actually was a profound spiritual experience, and it has continued to resonate, I think, for both of us. Yeah.
Yeah. I was staying there at that house that last night. So I got up at 6 a.m. and spent some time with her a few hours before she passed. And for like a year after that, I just spontaneously started getting up at 6 a.m. every morning, and I would meditate for long periods. We both did. It just really gave us that energy and towards the urgency of kind of spiritual practice. But it's a good frame, Peter. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that as a shared death experience, but I believe you're right. So thank you so much for this conversation. This was lovely. I feel inspired and uplifted. And so hopefully folks watching and listening might feel the same. And I enjoy our connection, Peter, just getting to know you better personally, and hope to stay in touch.
Same here. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I got to show you guys this. So there was an article that you were interviewed for, right? For my local newspaper.
Right.
They contacted you and they interviewed you guys in that video. So an anonymous person at my small bank mailed this to me this week. So they cut it out and they put it on plastic and they mailed it to me, and I don't know who did it.
Wow.
But somebody sent this article
That's
to me
amazing.
about you guys.
That's so funny.
So,
I would love to see it. I wonder
Yeah.
if we can track it down somehow, or you could send us a photo of it or something. That's so wonderful.
I will make that happen.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Peter. Such a pleasure, and looking forward to having you back on the channel. And yeah, stay warm, stay safe out there, and we will certainly be in touch.
Take care, Peter. Have a lovely day.
Good to see you both. Peace be with you both.
Same.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.